Okay, welcome back, guys. We're going to be starting chapter 4, and this is one of my favorite chapters. It's on finances. Okay, and finance is interesting in that when we're in K through 12 school, we don't ever really receive any kind of formal education. Okay. And so we're essentially relegated to learning to be financially responsible from, our parents or whoever raises us. So, and even when you get in college, there aren't really any courses, unless you're a finance major, that really teach you how to be financially savvy. Okay, and so hopefully that's kind of the goal of this chapter. So, and finance guys, or we could call it money, although money's not finance. But I'm sure at one time or another we find ourselves stressing about money. We can have enough money, or I need to make more money. I have debts. I have credit cards. I have student loans, or I have a mortgage, or I have a car payment, or I've got to pay for insurance. Groceries keep going up because of inflation. So, I want to be able to take a vacation and I don't have the money. So, becoming financially responsible and also financially independent is something that we should all seek. All right, so, the first thing we're going to talk about is budget and cash flow. So in my face-to-face classes, I'll typically ask the class, how many people have a budget, or how many people have made a budget. Okay, so a budget is just a way to keep track of where your money's going, essentially, and it gives you an idea of how much money you have, how much extra you have that you could potentially save and invest for other things. Okay. All right, so let's look at a few tips here. And interestingly, this section is entitled Taking Control of Your Finances. Okay, so all right, so controlling your finances. Let's look at these different bullets here. It says know your bank balance. Okay. Now it says here avoid bouncing a check or having your credit card rejected. Most people these days don't use checks a whole lot. Okay. I grew up using checks. And so the nice thing about checks is that you always had a checkbook. And within that checkbook you had a ledger. And that you updated that ledger. Every time you wrote a check, you would subtract that amount from the balance, or every time you made a deposit, you would add that amount to the balance. And so you would hear people commonly say, upon being asked or upon buying something, they would say, let me check the checkbook, or let me look at the checkbook, because the checkbook had the ledger or the up-to-date balance. Okay. And unfortunately with debit cards, a lot of people don't keep up with that balance. Okay. And of course, I know we can access our checking account and see what the balance is, but that's the first thing you want to do, guys, is always know what that balance is. Okay. I'm sure we've all at some point have probably overdrafted our account and have had to potentially pay a late fee, or an overdraft fee rather. Okay, and those can become costly. And there are instances in which individuals may, frequently overdraft their account and have to pay, a plethora of overdraft fees. So we want to try to avoid that if at all possible. The second thing is know what you spend. In particular, keep track of your debit and credit card spending. Okay. Ask yourself, Is this something that I need? Is this an impulse buy? If you think it's going to be an impulse buy, then just don't buy it. Okay? I always like to, if there's something that I'm interested in or that I want, but it's not necessary, I always like to wait. Sometimes I'll wait a few weeks, sometimes I'll wait a few months, depending on the scale of the purchase. And occasionally, guys, you'll find yourself that when you wait, you'll realize that, hey, I don't actually want that particular item as bad as I did, or I don't want it at all. Okay? So having patience and discipline is very important. Don't buy on impulse. Okay? Think first, then buy only if you're sure that the purchase makes sense to you. You know, a lot of these, you may think, well, these seem pretty common sense. Okay? Well, they may be common sense, yet there are many people that are financially in dire straits because of these things. So, and then the fourth bullet point here, it says make a budget and don't overspend it. Okay, we're actually going to look at an Excel file that I have in which there is a budget. Okay, and I'm going to make a short video kind of going over how you allocate certain amounts of money to certain areas to make a budget, to figure out what your net cash flow is. Typically, you could make a weekly budget, you could make a monthly budget or a yearly budget, but a monthly budget is typically the most common because most expenses, think about rent or a car payment, things of that nature, they're done typically on a monthly basis. All right, so a budget is just a process by which you determine how much money you have coming in versus how much you have leaving. It's pretty simple. And then making adjustments accordingly, okay, so that it becomes financially sustainable. So your goal is to always have more coming in than you have exiting. Okay, now there may be times in which you have more exiting than you have coming in, but that shouldn't be the norm. On average, you want a surplus there, because with a surplus, that allows you to then save. It says, by this we mean trying to ensure that, at least in the long run, or like I said, on average, we've got more coming in than we have going out for expenses. So, for example, you know, when you're ready to leave the house, you know, it would be a wise idea to go ahead and make a budget. Figure out what your total income is and all potential expenses, and a little bit extra as well, you know, for emergencies, things of that nature, if your car breaks down. All right, so let's look at these 4 steps in making a budget. It says determine what your average monthly income is. And it says average because there's certain jobs or occupations in which your income can fluctuate. Let's say you work in sales, or you work in the, another facet of the service industry, like you're a server, you're a bartender, okay, and your income is essentially tips. Okay, so that can change. So you would have to figure out what that average monthly income is. Secondly, determine your average monthly expenses. Again, it says average because not all expenses are on a monthly basis. So, for example, tuition. Okay, if you're paying out of pocket, then you may have to pay for tuition all at once, but that covers essentially, you know, a 4-month span of time. You would have to plan for vacations. Okay, if you want to go on a Christmas vacation at the end of the year and you know it's going to cost $5,000, then you need to figure out how much is that going to be per month so that you can then allocate that quantity of money each month in savings so that you have $5,000 at the end of the year. Other things like insurance. Okay, now I know insurance can be paid monthly, but it can also be paid every 6 months. And typically you can get a little lower rate if you choose to pay for 6 months at a time. All right, and then you want to determine what's called your cash flow. Okay, by subtracting your total expenses from your total income. And you want that cash flow to be positive. You do not want it to be negative. If it's negative, guys, that just means that each month you're essentially going further and further in debt. And then make any adjustments as needed. Okay, you may have to tweak some figures. So, however much, if you're coming up short or you're in the negative and you've allocated so much money for entertainment each month, you may have to reduce that amount so that you can meet your other financial obligations. All right, so what is cash flow? Well, it's basically what you have left over. Okay, positive cash flow is having more income than you have expenses. And this is what you want. This should be your goal right here. And then negative cash flow is what you want to try to avoid. It's having more expenses than income. Okay, and this is a very simple formula that would allow you to calculate it. So net cash flow is just your total income minus your total expenses. And hopefully you have a positive number there. All right, let's go ahead and look at an example here, okay? So this is an average person's expenses, and this also shows how these expenses are distributed among the different categories here, okay? So you can see we've got food, housing, clothing and services, transportation, healthcare, entertainment, donations to charity, personal insurance, and pensions. So pensions basically is just another name for retirement. And then we have these different age categories. So under 35 here is this kind of magenta color. 35 to 64, this is the light blue. And then this very light tan represents spending by those that are 65 or older. So if you look here at all these categories, the spending by age is roughly the same. See these bars, they essentially have the same length. For food, for housing. Now it falls off here for clothing and services, and that's probably because as you get older, you tend to spend less on clothing because you're not as perhaps concerned about your appearance. Or, if you had to wear a suit the entire time you're working, you're no longer, you don't have to worry about buying suits anymore. So that kind of falls off, and then transportation kind of falls off with age as well. One thing that does increase with age is health care, right? Because as we age, it's inevitable that our bodies break down and they wear out. And then entertainment is roughly fixed across these three different age groups. Donations to charity, this is interesting. It's the older individuals that tend to donate more to charity. And this makes sense as well because hopefully you've worked the majority of your life so that when you are older, you have more money than you've ever had. Okay? Hopefully you've got your house paid for so you don't have a mortgage. Any other types of loan or debt is paid for. And then finally here, personal insurance and pension. Okay? So this, when it says pension, this would mean the money that you contribute to retirement each month. And you can see that's actually quite low for the 65 and older crowd, okay? Because you're contributing during your working years. And we'll talk more about that in this chapter as well. Okay, so let's look at this example. It says, compute the total cost per year of the following pairs of expenses. Then complete this sentence for each pair. Okay, on an annual basis, the first expense is blank percentage of the second expense. All right, now I want to point out here that this example 1 is not related to this graphic. I put this graphic in here just to illustrate some things, these different categories, expense categories, and then how age determines those, has a bearing on those expenses. Okay, so example 1 here. It says Homer spends $10 per week on lottery tickets and $600 per month on rent. So it says on an annual basis, the first expense is what percentage of the second expense? Okay, so what we need to do here, there's a couple ways we could tackle this. Notice that the expense on rent is given by month, and then the expense on lottery tickets is given by week. Okay, so what we could do, what we need to do is we need to prorate these. That's what it's called. We'll talk about that later on, but we essentially need to see how much Homer is spending on lottery tickets per year, and also how much he is spending on rent per year. Okay. All right, so this kind of takes us back to those conversions, if you remember. So $10 per week on lottery tickets, and we know that there are 52, well, yeah, we'll just say there aren't exactly 52 weeks in a year, but we'll just say that there are. There are 52 weeks in 1 year, okay? And notice where I put the weeks, I oriented them such that they will divide out, or that unit of time divides out, and we're left with 10 times 51, and it's going to be dollars, which is $520 per year. We still have that unit of time, year, left in the denominator here. All right, so this is expense 1, okay? Expense number 2 is rent. So he's paying $600 per month in rent. And of course we know that there are 12 months, okay, in 1 year. So that unit month is going to divide out, and we're going to multiply straight across again. We're going to be left with dollars. 12 times 600 is, I believe, $7,200 per year. Okay, so that's expense number 2. All right, now the question asks, oh, that's it. Yeah, see, on an annual basis. So we had to annualize each of these expenses. So the first expense is what percentage of the second expense? So the way you find this is you take the first expense and you divide it by the second expense. Now that's going to give you a decimal, and then you convert that decimal into a percentage. So essentially this is what we're doing. Expense 1 divided by expense 2. Okay, so in other words, $520 per year divided by $7,200 per year. We'll get out the calculator. And this is going to give us 0.072 with the 2 repeating forever. All right, now this is a decimal. We'll review this in the next video, but to convert a decimal to a percentage, you just multiply it by 100. And multiplying it by 100 will essentially move this decimal to the right 2 places. Okay, remember scientific notation, 100 is the same as 10 to the 2nd power, so that's going to move that decimal 2 places. So if we do that, we're going to end up with 7.22222%, but I'm just going to leave it at 7.2%. And actually, if you look back up here, it tells us how to round. It says round to the nearest percent. So the nearest percent means the ones place. And so there's a 2 behind the 7, so we're not going to round up. We're going to round down, which makes this 7%. So that means that the first expense on an annual basis is 7% of the second expense on an annual basis. Okay, so you've got a homework question like that. Here's another one. Example 2, it says, compute the total cost per year of the following pair of expenses. Then complete the sentence. On an annual basis, the first expense is blank percent of the second set of expenses. So this is the same type of problem. It says Suzanne's cell phone bill is $73 per month, and she spends $223 per year on student health insurance. Okay, so the second expense is already given to us on an annual basis, so we don't need to modify that one. However, the first expense is given to us on a monthly basis, so we do need to modify that. So she spends $73 per month. Okay, so again, we know that there's 12 months in a year. And we're going to divide out those months. And let's see what 73 times 12 is. $876. So $876 per year. Okay, so this is expense 1. And then expense 2 is already annualized. Okay, she spends $223 per year. And this is expense 2. Okay, so again, we'll do it the same way. It's going to be expense 1, $876 divided by expense 2, which is $223. And this gives me, I'm going to carry this out to, I don't know, 3 decimal places. So 3.928. Okay. Now again, remember that this is a decimal and we need to convert it to a percentage. So you're going to multiply by 100, or in other words, move that decimal to the right 2 places, and this will become 392.8%. And it says, again, we want to round it to the nearest percent, so that means the ones place. Okay. Well, we've got an 8 behind the 2, so that's going to bump that 2 up to a 3. So this will become 393%. Now you may be wondering, well, this doesn't sound right. Okay, because the last one was like 7%, right? Well, this is correct because when you look at the first expense, it's roughly 4 times as large as the second expense. Okay? And therefore, it's almost 400% the second expense. Remember, if somebody were to tell you, I'm going to give you a 100% raise, that means they would be doubling your salary. Okay, let's say you make, I don't know, $30,000 a year, and you're getting not a 20% raise or a 30% raise, you're getting a 100% raise. So you would add another $30,000 to that. So then you'd be making $60,000 per year. Okay. All right, now let's talk about, or think about credit cards here for a minute. Again, if this were a face-to-face class, I would ask you, how many people have, or at least have had in the past, a credit card? Okay, and then I might ask you, how many people have carried a balance on that credit card? Okay, these are important things, because you can, credit cards are not in and of themselves evil. Okay, just depends on how you use the credit card. It can be healthy credit card behavior and unhealthy credit card behavior. Now, we'll talk more in detail about credit cards later on, though. You do need to know, though, that if you are borrowing money, which is what you're doing when you use a credit card, you're probably going to pay more to borrow that money than you will with the use of any other, financial instrument or loan. Okay, credit cards have really high interest rates. Yeah, they make money by charging you, the consumer, a certain percentage on every dollar that's borrowed. Okay, and that money that they charge you, that's what we call interest. So you pay interest to be able to use that money that you didn't initially have. Okay, so here's an example. If the monthly interest rate for a certain credit card is 2%, okay, so that's the monthly interest rate. The annual interest rate, you would have to multiply that by 12 and you get 24%, okay, which is actually quite common for credit cards. And you go, okay, so you've got this credit card. It has a monthly interest rate of 2%, and you go out and, let's say on impulse, you buy a $1,000 TV. Okay, you can't really afford it, so that's why you're using a credit card. Then you're going to pay $20 in interest that first month, okay, because that's what 2% of $1,000 would be. It would be $20. And typically what happens is when you start paying that credit card back, they will charge you, you'll have to pay a little bit back on the principal. The principal is a fancy term for the amount of money that you borrowed. Okay, so of that $1,000, they might require you to only pay $10. And then, of course, that $20 for interest, so you'd be paying a total of $30. But you can see that most of what you would be paying back that first month would be interest. All right, then you will pay 2% on the remaining balance, which will still be close to $1,000. It will have come down a little bit, but not by much over the next month. And then this process just continues for many months into years after it's all over. Okay, and lots of times, guys, if you're just paying the minimum on a credit card and you go out and buy a $1,000 TV, after you have that credit card paid off, you will have paid probably at least double the amount of the TV, if not more than that. Okay, because most of the minimum payment is interest. All right. So that's why I put here in the notes, it says, try to never pay just the minimum unless absolutely necessary. So if you do have credit card debt and you're trying to pay on it, trying to pay it off, try to pay extra if you can. And sometimes you may need to check and make sure that extra is actually going to the principal, because sometimes if you pay extra, they'll just put that towards the next month's bill. Okay. All right, but anyway, let's do this example 3, and then I think I'm going to cut this off for now, and we'll finish up with part 2. So example 3, It says find the monthly interest payment in each of the following situations. When an annual rate is given, assume that the monthly interest rate is 1/12 of that, right? Which makes sense because there's 12 months in a year. And interest rates are typically given on an annual basis. So it says Brooke's credit card has an annual interest rate of 21% on her unpaid balance, which averages $900. Okay. All right, so we need to figure out what is the monthly interest going to be on this balance. Well, the first thing we need to do is figure out what the monthly interest rate is. Well, if the annual interest rate is 21%, then the monthly interest rate is going to be 1/12 of that. In other words, we need to divide by 12. Okay, so 21 divided by 12, and we get 1.75. So this is the interest rate as a percentage. All right, now, essentially what we're trying to do is we're trying to find what is 1.75% of the balance, which is $900. So if you guys recall, that word of in math should connote multiplication. So in other words, we need to multiply 1.75% by $900. Okay? But you first have to convert this percentage to a decimal. And you may say, well, wait a minute, isn't it already a decimal? Well, it has a decimal in it, but it's not a decimal. Okay? It's a percentage because it's got a percentage sign, symbol. So if you remember converting a decimal to a percentage, you multiply by 100. If you're going to go in the opposite direction and convert a percentage to a decimal, you're going to divide by 100, which would actually move the decimal to the left 2 places, right? Again, remember that scientific notation. I'm just going to show this for you anyway. Okay. Divide that by 100, you are going to get 0.0175. Okay. So now if we multiply that by that average balance of $900, this will give us the monthly interest that she's going to pay. And so you could figure this out yourself. You know, if you're buying a house, you could figure, you know, I'll give, for example, the interest rate on my mortgage, which is a loan for a house, essentially, is, I believe, 5 1/8. Okay, so I could divide that by 12, multiply it by the principal, how much I owe, and whatever that number is, that's how much money I'm going to pay that month in interest. And it'll make you sick, guys, if you do that. If you're just starting to buy a house and just starting to make those payments, the majority of the payment goes to interest, and very little actually goes to paying off the loan. Now, at the very end of the mortgage, so let's say 30 years down the line, those monthly payments, almost all of it goes to the principal and very little to interest. And we'll talk about why that is later on in this chapter. All right, but for now, I'll go ahead and divide that in my calculator by 100 and then multiply by that average balance, $900. And we're going to get, this will be in dollars, $15, whoops, $15.75, okay? So that's how much Brooke would be paying per month if she were able to maintain an average balance of $900. And that minimum payment would probably be pretty small. It would be this interest plus a little bit that would go towards the balance here. All right, well, I think we're at a pretty good stopping place. we're going to finish this up. We're going to talk about prorating expenses, okay? And then we're going to talk a little bit about insurance, okay? What exactly is insurance, and why do we have it, and is it worth it, okay? All right, so I'll see you in the second part of this video.